Galveston, an island in the Gulf of Mexico, 30 miles long and 2 miles wide. It has been occupied by Indians, pirates, Civil War troops, early Texas impresarios, high rollers, and hordes of tourists and fun seekers. What is this place called Galveston? How do you explain the heart and soul of a community that is connected to, or disconnected from, the rest of Texas only by a causeway and a ferry? It has survived hurricanes, loss of population, major business setbacks, and decline of importance in the state. Nonetheless, modern Galveston, with its Victorian mansions framed by tall, slender palm trees, popular restaurants and hotels, booming cruise ship industry, and dramatic ocean views, still attracts and lures visitors to this island so steeped in history.
It's hard to describe to people in the north or in the west that you live on an island 50 miles south of Houston, Texas, that has palm trees.
Galveston is really special because of the fact that we're an island, we're surrounded by water, and because we have an extraordinary collection of historic buildings that is almost unmatched in the United States.
Galveston is a very tolerant place because we have such a diversity of people and lifestyles. It makes it very interesting and exciting.
Galveston has such a draw. It's a magnet for any eclectic soul out there that it just brings you to the island.
Galveston has never been for everybody. She is exactly what she is. She's vibrant, she's beautiful. She has heart and soul and history, and we wouldn't want her any other way.
It's a very easy lifestyle, and you have so much visual all the time. Beautiful sunsets, beautiful sunrises. The water shows the temperament almost of what's happening at that time in the city.
Galveston is special for a number of reasons. People say history. Well, clearly it's one of the oldest cities in Texas. It's special because it's on the coast. It's only 45 minutes away from Houston, but it feels like a day away. And that's why it's special.
It always feels wonderful to come back to Galveston. And on a day like today, which is a very gorgeous day, drive over that causeway and see the water. It's like everything that I had going on with me is suddenly off me.
When I cross the causeway, I can feel my blood pressure drop. It's a wonderful feeling to come over the causeway and feel that, oh, I'm home.
When people think of Galveston, probably the first thing that comes to mind are the beaches and the tourist attractions. Places like Moody Gardens, Schlitterbahn, and the Strand.
One thing that makes Galveston very cool is the culture.
We all come together during the holidays and we celebrate with Dickens on the Strand. We love special events in Galveston. It's like having an open house. We invite our friends and our family to come and join us, and then we have a good party.
Galveston is a three-leg stool. We have the port, which continues to be an economic driver in the community. We have tourism, which has become a bigger driver in the community from an economic standpoint. But Galveston is also a college town. We have the only city in the state of Texas that has both flagship universities. We have Texas A&M University, we have the University of Texas Medical Branch.
I guess we're kind of unique because we have, as a town, we have an official bird, which is the reddish egret, and we have an official tree, which is a palm tree, and of course we're the oleander city.
The city's shops, restaurants, and hotels welcome tourists all year long.
We need tourists, we need tourism, we need those tourist dollars. We have a kind of a social infrastructure that's built on that, but I think in many ways as a community we've defaulted to a tourist image rather than a residential community and a community where we want people to live and call this their home.
The seawall, of course, is just fantastic with a sidewalk. And then our beaches. There's a saying here, if you get sand between your toes, that you will never leave. And if you leave, you'll always be back.
Every year, the AIA Sandcastle competition takes place on Stewart Beach. Architecture students from all over the state compete to design the most innovative and outstanding sandcastle. Thousands of tourists come to the island for the event. But Galveston is more than a tourist center. It is a city rich in history and culture. In the early years, Galveston was inhabited by the Karankawa Indians. Later on, notorious pirate Jean Lafitte occupied the island and used it as his base of operations for selling contraband. Legend has it that Lafitte gave the island its name, calling it Galvez Town after Bernardo de Galvez, the Viceroy of Mexico. It is rumored that Lafitte's buried treasure is somewhere on the island.
Galveston should not be built where it is. New Orleans should not be built where it is. But the fact that they are means that they should still be here. Galveston could not be Galveston anywhere else. It's built on basically a sandbar.
Galveston's biggest attraction was its natural harbor. During the Civil War, it was an appealing location for commerce as it became the main transfer point for people and goods headed for the mainland of Texas.
Well, the history of Galveston is absolutely so intertwined with the story of Texas that it's just almost inseparable at any time. Port of Galveston, being one of the only natural ports on the Gulf of Mexico, made it a natural as a place of commerce and immigration to Texas.
I think the fact that Galveston was the second largest port of immigration provides a richness and a texture to the state that a lot of other places don't have.
Galveston grew quickly as a seaport, shipping cotton out of Texas and bringing needed farming supplies into the state. By 1880, Galveston was the largest and most cosmopolitan city in Texas, with a population of 22,248. With a certain degree of arrogance, Galveston residents considered themselves to be the elite of Texas society.
It was a shipping center, it was a financial center, we had insurance companies, to some extent it was a tourist center as well.
Let's go down the line of Galveston history. There are so many firsts for the state of Texas, so many things that started here. First electric lights, first gas lights, first chartered bank started in Galveston, first public library. There are very few people I see as I travel around the state of Texas, very few people who don't have some connection back to Galveston Island and its history.
Galveston historically is absolutely key to this state. There's a very real part of me that says that in itself should be reason enough for the state to care about us.
Galveston was the home of prominent architects who designed its Victorian-era stores and office buildings, as well as beautiful homes for the city's well-to-do. Galveston figured it would soon rival New Orleans.
She was it between New Orleans and Corpus Christi, and I think stood prominently over either of those. Just her charm, her architecture, her history, everything about her sets her apart.
Just as Galveston was booming, the great storm of 1900 came across the Gulf and hit the island. Local residents had always looked upon hurricanes as more of an inconvenience, but this one would be the worst natural disaster in U.S. history.
The 1900 storm struck. The governor of the state of Texas declared martial law, appointed 5 people to essentially rebuild Galveston. There was no government to take care of anyone, so Galvestonians had to do it themselves. They had to build it up, they had to make it work themselves. They didn't wait on anybody. We lost, depending on whose book you read, we lost 12,000 people. The fact of the matter is no one knows how many people were lost. We lost a tremendous number of people.
Not long after the great storm of 1900, when the island was covered by the Gulf, city leaders realized the need to better protect the island and came up with an engineering marvel for its time. They would build a 17-foot-high seawall between the ocean and the city, and they would raise the grade of every building.
Galveston's history proves that Galvestonians are survivors. So after the 1900 storm, the seawall was the first thing that Galveston did, and that is a wonderful structure that helped us with Ike.
The island grew to be the most popular tourist destination along the Texas Gulf Coast. The Hotel Galvez, a grand structure overlooking the Gulf, opened its doors in 1911. With its fashionable Mediterranean-style architecture, it quickly became the favorite place to be seen for Galveston's high society. It was known as the Queen of the Gulf. Over the decades, the Hotel Galvez would host the rich and famous, people like Teddy Roosevelt, Howard Hughes, and Frank Sinatra, as well as thousands of vacationing families from all parts of Texas. The Galvez became the temporary White House when President Franklin Roosevelt visited Galveston. In the early 1900s, city leaders began to promote tourism to boost the island's economy. Crowds flocked to the island from all over the Southwest to enjoy the beaches and the popular amusement parks. One popular attraction, Electric Park, was said to closely rival New York's Coney Island. Tourists would rent beachwear at the bathhouses. Ladies' beach attire in the Victorian era would protect them from exposure to the sun and male onlookers. Galveston had a city ordinance that required bathers to be covered from knee to elbow. In the 1920s, the island hosted a popular beauty contest called the Bathing Girl Review. After a few years, the name was changed to the International Pageant of Pulchritude, and young beauties from all over the world would parade around in the fashionable swimsuits of the day. It would later on become the Miss Universe pageant. These events attracted big crowds to the seawall. Some records state as many as 150,000 people showed up for the festivities. The city no longer enforced the ordinance for women's beach attire. Later on, the famous $1 million pleasure pier would be built out over the water. It was a 4-block-long amusement pier. Shows were staged in the large outdoor theater. During the 1950s, the official opening of Galveston's beaches for the season was a huge celebration called Splash Day. Thousands of rowdy college students flooded the island for the weekend. For the rest of the year, the island continued to attract families.
I started coming here when I was 5 or 6, and our one vacation every year was 3 or 4 days in Galveston. It was really wonderful. We would stay at the Galvez or the Buccaneer. I remember once we stayed at the Jack Tar. It was pure magic when we came over the causeway and when we hit the seawall and there was the whole majesty of the Gulf in front of us. That was as magic a thing as I can think of in my lifetime. The seawall was very similar to what it is now, always very busy. We would always go to Murdoch's, Guido's, and Hills, which was out there.
Galveston did rebuild after the 1900 storm, but it had lost some of its luster and began to decline as a center of commerce. Business owners moved their operations closer to the railroad centers of Houston and Dallas. Galveston's location on the Gulf began to work against it, and by 1920 it was no longer the largest city in Texas. It now trailed Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio in population. The city would never recover its position of political influence and social prestige. Business at Galveston's once bustling port had fallen way behind pesky upstart Houston with its busy man-made 50-mile ship channel, not even a natural port.
We went through a period of time that we were in decline. There's no question about that.
Galveston Island seemed frozen in time. During Prohibition in the 1920s, the sale and use of liquor and beer were illegal in the U.S., but there was still big demand for liquor, and Galveston's position on the coast made it an attractive spot to smuggle it in. In fact, the island became the main supplier of bootleg liquor for Houston, Dallas, and other cities in the Southwest.
You start really with the 20s, and then it really begins to roar with Prohibition, with all the bootlegging, and of course the illegal gambling, and then the brothels, the bawdy houses on Post Office Street.
By the time Prohibition was repealed by Congress, gambling and other forbidden pleasures had become a big part of the island city's economy. City leaders looked the other way, and Galveston earned the name Free State of Galveston because of its anything goes attitude.
Galveston marches to its own drum, and it always has.
In the 1930s and 40s, popular nightclubs, such as the Turf Club, brought in big-name entertainment and offered gambling and illegal drinking in the back rooms. Out-of-towners arrived looking for a good time and filling the island's hotels and clubs.
When we first got here, we were amazed. Somebody had told us that Galveston's reputation was Sin City of the South. And we didn't quite know what that meant until we got into the community and understood that gambling and prostitution and liquor and all that good stuff was illegal but tolerated in Galveston.
One of Galveston's most famous landmarks was the glamorous Balinese Room, the premier night spot along the Texas coast in the 1940s and 50s. It was built on a huge pier extending out over the Gulf.
My husband and I came to Galveston in 1955. Neither one of us had ever lived on the coast, and so we thought that would be a wonderful idea to live on an island. There were two gambling establishments in Galveston. The first one was the Hollywood Dinner Club, and then there was another gambling establishment that we found out was the Balinese Room, which was located at 21st Street. It was out on a pier. You would see these big limousines drive up with all the fancy people getting out.
Oh, now there was paradise on earth. Of course, you know, it had the porcelain palm trees around the dance floor with black neon lighting in them that made the men's shirts look like they were blue when they were on the dance floor. That was a big deal. And hand-painted murals of the island of Bali around the walls. And of course, the gambling room was way in the back after you had walked a half a block on that pier to get there.
It was it was Art Deco. When you went, you wore your fancy clothes. We saw Phil Harris there, Alice Faye. We saw Bob Hope.
Law enforcement had a tough time enforcing the state's anti-gambling laws in Galveston. The local sheriff said he didn't have enough men to raid the places, and if he did close them, business at the island's hotels would suffer.
The Rangers would come to raid us, but there was a gal on the front door, see, that had 3 buttons on the floor. One for the door onto the pier, one for the door off the pier, and the middle one she hit when she saw the Rangers, which said, raid, raid, raid.
Rangers would come in and they would go back, and by the time they got to the dining room, the band would strike up The Eyes of Texas, and everybody would stand up, and this would deter the Texas Rangers.
By the time these guys would get back to the gambling room, well, the craps tables had become pool tables, or billiards tables rather. The roulette wheels had been were on wheels and shoved under panels, and the blackjack tables folded up into the walls, and the slot machines were thrown through a trap door down into the Gulf of Mexico.
So by the time the Rangers got there, there was nothing going on.
But time ran out for the infamous Balinese Room, and finally state authorities shut down the gambling operation.
The shutdown was in 1957, conducted by the then Attorney General Will Wilson, who had no choice because the mayor of Galveston had challenged him on Galveston being an open city, and it would remain that way, so he had to go to war.
The Balinese Room continued on as a restaurant, but had lost the excitement and glamour. It became such a legend that Texas rock group ZZ Top wrote a song about it called Balinese. Just as other major ports around the world, Galveston had a thriving red light district. Sailors would rush off their ships and head for the district for an evening of fun.
We had a very infamous red light district here. It started like 1890, when all the houses from 25th Street to 30th, all the fashionable homes were being converted into bordellos, and saloons were popping up all over the place.
Victor Lang played the piano at one of the bordellos.
I played mostly Scott Joplin, the Maple Leaf Rag, of course, the entertainer before everybody knew about that. But I didn't play anything that was slow or romantic, and I'll tell you why. They wanted to keep the traffic moving. So you kept the music lively. People, the clients drank more and were in a bigger hurry to get upstairs, to be blunt.
Mary Rimmers was commissioned to write a book about the bordellos.
The book is called Going Down the Line, and that was terminology that meant going from one brightly lit bordello to the next. The madams, in fact, there are two that I can think of that married Galvestonians and took their place in Galveston society. No big deal.
But by the 1960s, the bordellos were closed and gambling had been forced out. It was the end of the free state of Galveston. The city suffered further economic decline. It still had its glistening beaches, but nearby were shuttered businesses, rundown buildings, and decaying houses. The two main employers in the now sleepy town were an insurance company and the medical school.
Like any great institution, any great thing or person that's been around for a long time, she has dark pages in her history and bright pages in her history. And all of it adds up to what she ultimately is. That sweet and sour, that wonderful, and a little bit on the shady side too.
People who are born in Galveston are called BOI, born on the island. Many have fond memories of growing up here.
I grew up on the island at a great time. We played in the street without any fear. We played in the neighborhood without any fear. We rode our bikes everywhere. We walked up to the beach. We had great amusement park here that was just such fun.
The 50s was a time when there was illegal gambling in Galveston. And for a boy to grow up in Galveston in the 50s and 60s, you grew up pretty quickly. It was a great place.
You find somebody that's born on this island and they wear that designation of born on the island, BOI, like a Medal of Honor winner. It's a proud thing for them.
People who move to the island are called IBC, Islander by choice.
When my husband and I and our kids arrived to Galveston, it wasn't as developed as it is today, but it was still a beautiful port city, a lot of historical areas, and of course the ocean itself. I love the beach, and that in and of itself, was enough to make, regardless of where you lived, a wonderful place to live. I really am proud to be here. It's one of the more open-minded cities in the state, I think. And it's a great place to raise a family, to be involved.
I will quote my father, who said that if you were born here and raised here and stayed here, and I did almost all of that the salt did something to your brain, and you developed a love for Galveston that nothing could extinguish.
Because of its role as a port of entry and an immigration center, early on, Galveston began to take on a multi-ethnic look, even before the rest of Texas.
Port of Galveston served as a point of entry for thousands and thousands of new immigrants to the United States and to Texas specifically.
I'm of Greek descent. My father chose Galveston because he followed other family members here who are also Greek. And they were in the restaurant business here in Galveston, which was, at one time, the seawall was dominated by Greek family restaurants. They were all seafood restaurants. And it was a much different Galveston than you see today.
My father came to Galveston from New York, where he grew up, on a Mallory ship that made a regular run between New York and Galveston. So I think it being the second largest port of immigration, there was always a lot of color, so it was a place that attracted interesting people.
One of the attractive things about Galveston that I really love about it, and I think other people find it very charming too, is it's very multicultural.
German was the most common language in Galveston in the 1850s on the streets, and just the mixture of the Italians who did corner stores and opened up meat markets and so forth. And so the whole story of all of that is incredibly rich.
We have a very strong Italian community, a strong Greek community, a Mexican community.
So many different nationalities came through this port and immigrated here and then either stayed or went into Central Texas or beyond. So we have this amazing diversity of people with their own cultures and You can go to the Greek festival, and you go to the Christopher Columbus festival, or you can go to the Cinco de Mayo festival, that are neighborhood kinds of events that are very, very wonderful.
We see the greatest period of immigration from about the 1880s, 90s, up to about the 1920s. It's the most intense period of immigration. Galveston officially stopped being a point of immigration by the early 1950s.
Perhaps Galveston's location as an island in the Gulf can be most appreciated when arriving on the popular Bolivar Ferry. The ferry has operated for nearly 90 years and provides its passengers with a look at the entrance to the busy port of Galveston.
When I was a child, we would ride the Bolivar Ferry. What I love about it to this day is when that huge boat churns out of that slip and makes that turn, and there's the vast Bolivar roads that I never understood completely till I did my research. One of the great highways for pirates, for merchants, for cattle brokers, for immigrants, for 150, 200 years. And there's just something about that salt air in your face and the white caps out on that bay and those huge ships from all over the world out there waiting to make port. It never changes. It was that way in 1957, 58 when I rode it as a little boy. It's that way now when I ride it. And then there's the lighthouse across the way that you can focus on. That's part of me.
Since 1825, when Mexico designated Galveston as a port of entry, shipping has been a major factor in the Galveston economy.
We were the first port of entry in the Republic of Texas. Going back further than that, we were the site that Lafitte picked early on to make his home when he was encouraged to leave New Orleans.
Well, the Port of Galveston, of course, started well before the 19th century, but it got its real kick in the 19th century as it was recognized as being a place where really ships could come in.
Everywhere you look, you see reminders that Galveston is a port city.
We're a niche port, meaning we really can't compete with the Port of Houston. However, we do have geography, and every ship that goes to the Port of Houston has to go by the Port of Galveston.
In recent years, Galveston has begun to rival Florida ports for the growing cruise ship business and is home to the largest cruise ship terminal facility on the Gulf of Mexico.
It means a great deal as an economic engine. People would come from Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, New Mexico, whatever. Now we're finding international tourists. They come in a day or two early, or they stay a day or two after the cruise.
An important key to the continued vitality of the city is the University of Texas Medical Branch, established in 1891 as the first medical school in the Southwest.
If you say Galveston, the next word is UTMB. If you say Galveston, John Seeley Hospital.
Galveston is the largest teaching hospital in the state of Texas.
So it has had a significant impact on the number of physicians that are in this area.
The main business district of historic downtown Galveston was along the Strand. The Strand is still the focal point of the city's large collection of Victorian-era buildings.
Galveston has the longest contiguous row of steel front buildings in the United States, which a lot of people don't really realize, and they're down on the Strand. That Strand also survived the 1900 storm.
Not to be outdone by New Orleans, Galveston had its own Mardi Gras dating back to the 1880s. The Strand became the perfect site for the city's biggest celebration. Crowds coming in for the Mardi Gras events stayed at the city's many fine hotels, such as the Tremont House, which dates back to 1839. The Tremont House has hosted guests such as Sam Houston and Buffalo Bill.
I think that is sort of a magical moment for a lot of visitors to Galveston. When they actually enter some of these buildings, they see what the history and what the materials and what the stories are all about, and they start connecting themselves to what this great rich history is in Galveston.
As the cultural center of Texas, Galveston opened its European-style opera house in 1894. It is still standing and is in full operation today. As the grandest opera house and performing arts theater in the Southwest, it offered Galvestonians the finest in opera and musical entertainment.
The Grand was built in 1894 by an entrepreneur whose name was Henry Greenwald. Galveston was, at that time, the Wall Street of the Southwest. It was the premier city of Texas. The Grand started with an amazing array of performers who came here. Anna Pavlova danced on this stage several times. George M. Cohen played this theater 5 times with his wonderful vaudeville troupe. William Jennings Bryan orated from this stage. We had the wonderful Sarah Bernhardt, and John Philip Sousa brought his band here. It's a home to the Galveston Symphony. It's a home to Galveston Ballet. It's a home to a lot of people who come here every year and perform.
The city's historic churches have survived storms and population changes. St. Mary's Cathedral dates back to 1847. The main thoroughfare is Broadway, which runs across the island from the Causeway to the Gulf. In the 19th century, wealthy Galveston families built their mansions on this grand boulevard. Some are still standing today. One is the Bishop's Palace, an ornate Victorian mansion built around 1890 for a wealthy attorney and civic leader. He instructed the architect to build the grandest home in Texas. Later on, it was acquired by the Catholic Diocese. It gives a glimpse of how the wealthy lived in Galveston's golden age. The home has 4 fireplaces, one lined with pure silver, as well as hand-painted ceilings and skylights. The Bishop's Palace is considered one of the finest Victorian structures in the U.S. Nearby is Ashton Villa, where in 1865, Union General Gordon Granger announced President Lincoln's emancipation of the enslaved. It had taken 2 years for the news to reach slaves in Texas, and the day of the announcement became known as Juneteenth.
People in all parts of Texas should care about Galveston because of its history. Galveston has served an important function in the state. But beyond that, it is so different than the rest of the state.
Galveston and its people, ever resilient, survived the economic downturn of the 1960s. By the 1990s, Mardi Gras, which was discontinued during World War II, had returned to the island. Galveston began to see a renaissance. People from Houston and other parts of Texas began to realize the charm and appeal of Galveston's historic homes and buildings. They were soon buying the old homes and restoring them. Before long, new luxury hotels and tourist attractions were opening up. Cruise ships found Galveston's port to be ideal, and the island's beaches were rediscovered by tourists. With its palm-lined streets and esplanades of oleander, Galveston took on a renewed sense of glamour and pride.
In the 90s, with the help of George Mitchell, of course, and as the biggest booster, Galveston saw its greatest revitalization.
The Silk Stocking District, also known as the East End, saw many restoration projects. Some considered it one of the largest collections of Victorian architecture in the U.S.
From an economic standpoint, things became so rough that at that point in time that people didn't even tear down the buildings, which ends up being a real blessing for us, because once the economy started coming back, we still had all of these beautiful old buildings, and I would think that maybe we were lucky in one sense that we went through this decline and people just didn't even tear the buildings down. They just left them there.
So these areas began to be restored, the Strand and other places in the East End. So there began to be an interest in upscale real estate, and off-island people began to buy weekend homes and homes to retire in. And then the businesses began to open up on the Strand, and that not only attracted tourists, but some locals shopped there.
So it was exciting for other people to come and say, gee, the city looks good, and, and appreciate what most people, older generation than mine, had grown up with.
In addition to historical preservation, developers began constructing new high-rise condominiums. Not everyone in Galveston has been happy about the development along the beaches and wetlands. Buildings were erected right on the beaches, which caused concern about increased traffic and wear and tear of the fragile shoreline. Some geological experts say the beaches are eroding too fast and the island is sinking a few feet every year. Then, in September of 2008, came Ike, a hurricane more disastrous than ever imagined. It rivaled the 1900 storm, and Galveston was stopped dead in its tracks.
I really wasn't worried at that time. We were watching it intently, as we always do when hurricanes get into the Gulf. The thing that began to concern me and most of my friends was the size of this storm. The absolute size of it. When you looked at the weather picture, I mean, it practically covered the entire Gulf.
By September 12th, it looked like Ike was heading directly for Galveston. Seawater began to flood the downtown area a day before the hurricane was to arrive. And then there was a mass exodus off the island.
At that time, I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna stay here. I'm not leaving. I went home comfortably, had a good night's sleep, still listened to the weather, thinking that this thing is gonna move more. Woke up Friday morning, I said, well, I'm gonna go and look at the seawall. I drove up there that morning and the waves were crashing 25 feet in the air, and the storm was still 80 miles away. That's when I started thinking, maybe I should leave here. But then, I thought I'd just be gone. I'd be back on Monday, and everything would have blown over. There'd be a little trash in the streets, and that would be it.
We left a day before it actually hit. We returned several days before they actually opened it up to everyone else, because we knew we were going to come and work at the Disaster Recovery Center that FEMA was setting up. So we were here early on. It looked like a war zone. We saw a lot of debris along the highway coming in. Probably the most freakish part was seeing the boats that were still on the side of the highway, so many of them, and a lot of the debris that was piled up. Our house was gutted and everything thrown out, just like a lot of our neighbors, basically. We were a lot more fortunate because we had insurance.
The island was without power and drinking water for weeks.
There were no grocery stores that were available for you to get groceries in, or gasoline. The natural things of everyday living that you take for granted, basically, was not available.
It was painful to think of Galveston after Ike because it was like someone in your family that's had a stroke or a heart attack or some serious illness. I began thinking of the things that I would never see again, that I've seen all my life.
They didn't let us back on the island until September 23rd, so quite a bit of time. I saw all the television images, and I'm trying to see things that I recognized, and watch the Balinese in rubble on the seawall. I'm wondering what I would find, and it was worse than I imagined. It was worse than I imagined.
While some residents were anxious to get back and rebuild their homes, others would never return to the island.
After the storm, it broke my heart. Looking at the damage and all of those big boats and everything and trash piled up 4 stories down on Broadway, it just was devastating looking. Some people are deciding to go other places. They're deciding they don't want to go through this again.
Galveston after Ike was on a sort of life support because people had to come in from other parts of the country, from other parts of the state, to keep her alive for a while, with power, with resources, with all of the things that keep a community going. She was almost gone.
Hurricane Ike was devastating. More than 75% of the homes and businesses on the island were destroyed or damaged. The historic Strand took a destructive blow with more than 12 feet of water in its historic buildings. UTMB suffered a hard hit with more than $750 million in damage. UT Regents in Austin seriously considered closing the school permanently, which would have been a fatal blow to Galveston.
Having grown up here, I've been through several storms now, but this was different. I've heard from other Galvestonians my age and older, they've never seen anything like this.
The grand 1894 Opera House faced extensive water damage, and its caretakers felt it was vitally important to restore this Galveston icon.
We all, of course, believed that it would be a few days, we'd be back up, everything would be fine. We'd do a little cleanup and move on. But by Saturday morning, the 13th, we knew that that was not the case. Our supervisor contractor called me Saturday morning and he told me that clearly from the water line that we had about 8 feet of water in our front area. We also had had a small tornado that had peeled back the roof backstage. The stage was soaked. There was water that had gone up 10 rows of seats. I had to be very careful not to slide and fall down because that's what everybody was doing, because there was such a slickness to all of the, to all of the mud. But found really quickly that the essence of the theater, which is the lights, the sound, the seats, were all primarily intact.
Construction crews went to work immediately, and within a few weeks, the grand 1894 Opera House was ready to welcome its audiences.
There are a lot of optimists in Galveston, and a strength and a stick-to-itiveness and an energy that got them through the 1900 storm and every other occurrence that could fell lesser people.
Unfortunately, for Galvestonians, the storm that hit Galveston in September was followed by the economic storm that hit the whole world a week later. We were taken off of the radar screen very, very quickly, whereas New Orleans is still there.
I think Ike did a tremendous amount of psychological damage, and I think people feel much more vulnerable and recognize how vulnerable.
The damage was extensive on the first floor. The water got up to about 39 inches. When I got down here the next day, it looked like someone had ransacked the house. The refrigerator had floated and turned over. There was furniture in different rooms. It was amazing. It left a half an inch of muck on the floor.
To some extent, the seriousness of the damage and the hurricane sort of jolts you a little into reality that, not everything is great in paradise, that you do have that danger that lurks there from time to time, and we do get exposed to it.
Throughout its history, Galveston has been a highly visual reminder of human persistence and ingenuity.
When I drove by the flagship this morning, I saw what I've been seeing for some months now, and that is a whole section of it gone. You can actually see through it. You can see bedroom furniture in one corner. It's been there so long and stood majestically there on its pier for so long that the thought of losing it now is, for an old Galveston lover, a little bit hard to take.
Since Galveston's beaches are such an important resource and are so visible to the outside world, they were quickly restored. When the salt water of the Gulf covered the island, it also killed the ancient oak trees and most of the vegetation, including the colorful oleanders. The only survivors were the palm trees, now serving as a reminder that this is a tropical island. Some of the once majestic oak trees are finding new life as tree sculptures.
Galveston has long had a resiliency. I think people talk about it at the 1900 storm, but we saw a lot of the same problems they had, the smells, the dirt, the mud, the sludge, the sewage, the things that just kind of all came along with the flooding.
It can survive this hurricane, and it can certainly rebuild and move forward, and it has done so in many areas, as long as we have young people that are willing to come back and invest in the community, to keep it going.
If you look around town now, you see a lot of building going on. A lot of folks are, and they're exciting, but everybody's building. Everybody's working to get their place back. Everybody's working to get their business back.
Everybody is rebuilding this island.
We're survivors.
Galveston began to come alive again, and city leaders felt it was important to continue the Mardi Gras tradition and show the world that the island was prepared to host visitors. So 6 months after Hurricane Ike devastated the island, Galvestonians were ready to put on their masks and party. Mardi Gras would go on as usual.
Well, all of us here that have been through the hurricane are ready to have a very good time. I've been involved with the Mardi Gras in Galveston ever since it was brought back. There's a lot of volunteer work that goes into putting this on, and my husband and I have helped with quite a few of the parties.
One annual event is the Knights of Momus Royal Coronation and Mardi Gras Ball. The coronation is at the Grand 1894 Opera House.
The kickoff night begins tonight with Momus celebrating the revival and a great coronation.
It's great for the island. People come within hundreds and hundreds of miles to come down here and enjoy it. And it's special. We really have the best Mardi Gras outside of New Orleans.
So it's going to be terrific. Marching bands, doubloons, and fabulous costume characters.
At 7:30 we'll start the coronation, and that is the crowning of the king for this year. And after the coronation of the king, then we have the presentation of the 20 duchesses.
Being a native Galvestonian and a fifth generation, I love the Mardi Gras.
Many of us, this Mardi Gras is very important. It's a symbol that the island is here. We're strong. We're making our way back.
This is just the beginning of the festivities here at the Grand Opera House. When this is over, we proceed over to the San Luis Convention Center, and there's a fabulous ball there.
During Galveston's golden era, its residents considered the city to be the cultural leader of Texas. Even today, Galveston maintains a lively arts and culture scene with festivals and art exhibits.
Galveston's a very deceiving place for the population. It has so many things, everything from an incredibly talented creative side, from the performing arts to the visual arts.
One island resident wrote that Galveston cheers the eye, satisfies the senses, and replenishes the soul. All over the island, residents continue to reflect on the future of their community.
There's always been incredible spirit, and I find that common in people that live on an island. There wasn't much question as, are we going to move to higher land? The question was, when will the contractors come in so we can repair and get back into our homes?
In 1900, the first ship was loaded within 30 days of the 1900 storm. We beat that by some 20-some-odd days.
Most of our restaurants have come back, or they are coming back. There are some businesses that have not reopened, but some new ones are on the way, some different things.
The future's bright. For example, UTMB, University of Texas Medical Branch, is coming back bigger, better.
I feel very strongly that Galveston will come back, but in the midst of all this difficulty, there's a tremendous opportunity to bring it back even better than it was before.
And we're working very hard to envision Galveston as we'd like to see it, because now we have opportunities to rebuild, but maybe rebuild better.
I've been working on a downtown revitalization plan, trying to, in the context of preserving old buildings, of course, but bring back a vibrancy to downtown where people will want to live and people will want to work.
And people are really diligently working at trying to put a roadmap together to rebuild Galveston. Not only to rebuild it back the way it was, but rebuild it in a way in which people would like to see it in the future.
So as the island's residents envision the new Galveston, post-Hurricane Ike, one thing is for sure, the people here are survivors. The heart and soul of the island is reflected in its can-do spirit, a strong resiliency that has saved them before and they believe will save them again. When you cross the causeway onto the island, it is obvious. Galveston wants us to have a good time. It tugs at our hearts. It welcomes us to enjoy its seafood cafes, its parties and festivals, to explore its avenues, its culture, and its historic landmarks. And it sings to us of pirates, hurricanes, ships going out to sea, trips on the ferry, and family outings on the beach.
When I wrote that Galveston sings a song that only some of us can hear, I'm talking about a song that is sweet and pure, and it's built on memory, and it's built on history, and it's built on some kind of personal connection with this place.
We're islanders, and we're just a proud group of people that we're like family here.
There is an attitude in Galveston where people just get along, and we're a small community. We've been through many, many hardships, and we've always bounced back.
Well, the island itself is resilient. Its people are resilient. That is just a characteristic of the island that no storm will conquer.
Galveston was a fallen from grace, boozy, New Orleans-y, Tennessee Williams tonic. Sweet and bold as a jigger of Southern comfort. And she was a juggernaut of progress, pushing steel and concrete out to the water's edge. She's still those things. She's the past and the present dancing constantly with each other. And that's part of her charm. When you walk down the Strand, you could be in the 1920s. It's that easy to transport yourself because Galveston still is there. She's just what she always has been and always will be. She doesn't put on airs. She's a grand old lady, but she's aged very, very well.
Galveston, oh Galveston,